Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Joseph Hammer. I'm an assistant professor of counseling psychology at the University of Kentucky. This talk is entitled, Is This Real Life? Why Good Psychological Measurement Matters. So our agenda for today, I'm going to show you that good psychological measurement matters with some examples. When we use unreliable, invalid, or culturally insensitive instruments to measure psychological constructs like depression, our resulting findings may be false, and false findings can lead to offering misguided practice implications based on our results. And good measurement, making sure we measure things reliably and validly in a culturally sensitive manner, good measurement can lead to culturally sensitive research and practice. And the absence of good measurement can make us run afoul of those things. Our overview is, first I'm going to start with a bifactor analysis primer, and then I'll be talking about two bifactor investigations with wildly different outcomes that can illustrate some of the things we can discover through this method, and then bifactor analysis techniques as well as larger factor analysis and some other stuff will show up in the daily spiritual experiences study that I'll be talking about next, and then my favorite study is the measuring spiritual fitness study, and we'll save the best for last. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So, important caveats. First, most folks are interested in the meaning of research results rather than the nuances of the methods and analyses. So to avoid overwhelming or boring my audiences and to save time, I've tried to minimize the amount of time and slide space spent on the nitty-gritty details, as that information is available in the published papers from which I'm drawing for this talk. I also try and talk about fancy stats in a way that is accessible, which means I'm going to oversimplify some complex concepts. So I ask those of you who are stats experts to please forgive me for my imprecision. I, of course, am happy to answer any method questions you have during the Q&A at the end. The other caveat is that developing good psychological measures is really hard. I've developed several instruments myself, and some, honestly, are quite better than others, and all of them deserve to be critiqued by other scholars. So I'm going to be critiquing how people have used certain instruments and even the nature of the instruments themselves sometimes, and I want you all to know that I offer these critiques from a place of love and an understanding about how hard it is to create good instruments. So we're all in this together. Okay, so a quick poll. So how many of you use published self-report instruments that are multidimensional, meaning they have multiple subscales? So if you're a researcher, chances are you raised your hand to this question because a lot of instruments are like that. But here's the problem that was wonderfully illustrated by Rodriguez and colleagues in a 2016 publication. They reanalyzed 50 recent studies published in psychopathology, personality, and assessment journals. And they include this really interesting graph with some fancy stats that we don't have time to talk about. But the take-home point was that this reanalysis showed that for all of these instruments which used subscales, had subscale scores for these subscales, those subscale scores actually failed to reliably measure that subdimension, that facet of that psychological construct that they were supposed to measure. They were measuring something other than what they were supposed to measure, which is, of course, bad, right? We want the subscale to measure that subscale construct. And this is why we need to talk about this stuff, right? That's the whole premise. So the problem, numerous instruments are created to measure a single latent variable, such as self-efficacy or depression, but factor analysis studies tend to show conflicting evidence for uni versus multidimensionality. So are we measuring a single latent variable with this instrument or a variety of different but related latent variables or subdimensions of that larger variable? And bifactor analysis provides really helpful information when we're confronted with this conflicting evidence about uni versus multidimensionality, which is why it's so cool. So in order to understand bifactor analysis, we got to review some of the popular ways to model or understand the dimensionality, the factors of an instrument. And we've got 4 flavors we'll talk about. The first is a unidimensional model. And for this, let's say we've got an instrument with 12 items. in a unidimensional model, we say there's one giant factor, an overall factor, that explains the variance in all 12 items. So there's one big construct that's measured by these 12 items. A correlated factors model is a little more complicated. For this, we say that certain items load on certain specific factors, which we tend to think of as subscales. So you got those first 3 items on factor 1, those next 3 items on factor 2, etc. And these 4 factors in this case, all the factors are allowed to correlate with each other, hence called the correlated factors model. A second order factor model builds on the second order model, and then it says the reason why those 4 first order, lower order factors correlate with each other, the reason why those dimensions are related, because they all are explained by some higher order, some second order factor that explains why all these 4 things are related. And then a bifactor model is a twist on the second order model, in that instead of having a higher order dimension that's a second order dimension, it's yet another first order factor. Bifactor model stuff is hard to understand. It's hard to know the difference between that and a second order model. So I'm going to share some information about it to try and get us a footing. So a bifactor model is a model with a broad general factor, you can see that guy at the top, and narrower specific factors, you can see those 4 at the bottom, that compete against each other to account for variance in the items. All factors are set orthogonal to each other, which just means they're not allowed to correlate with each other. They're not allowed to touch. Unlike a second order model, all factors are first order factors. I mentioned that. And to specify a bifactor model, if I'm using M+ as a statistics program, for example, I tell M+ that every single item should load on the general factor up top, as well as simultaneously on one of those specific factors that it's supposedly related to. So each item loads on 2 different factors simultaneously, and some items mostly tap the general factor, some other items mostly tap the specific factor they're assigned to, and some items donate a little bit to the general factor and to the specific factor. So it just really varies, but the rule is that the items have to pick a side. Let me give you a rough example. So some of you may be familiar with intelligence research and how we conceptualize intelligence from a theoretical perspective. Many researchers believe that overall intelligence is a real construct that can be measured, but that intelligence is also defined by several subdimensions, such as verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, those guys at the bottom there. The bifactor model can account for both the overall intelligence construct up top, using the general factor, but also account for those narrower subdimensions using the specific factors below. The bifactor model concept takes some time to get comfortable with, so if you're feeling confused, don't worry, it took me 2 years to stop feeling confused, so this is your first day with it for most of you. The most important thing to know is that the bifactor model, unlike the second order model, forces the items to choose a side, so to speak. Each item must decide how well it will measure the general factor and how well it will measure the specific factor. And we force items to play this zero-sum game for 2 very good reasons. The first, it helps us determine whether our favorite instrument's total score is truly measuring the overall construct, the general factor it's supposed to measure, or if it's actually attempting to measure an overall construct that doesn't actually exist and can't really be measured. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it helps us determine if an instrument's subscale scores are truly measuring that specific subdimension that they're supposed to measure, or if they're merely remeasuring the overall construct without us realizing it. I'd like to share a few examples of how I've used bifactor analysis to add clarity to ongoing debates about how to best measure psychological constructs. So for example, we recently published a paper on the conformity to masculine role norms inventory 46, a very popular measure. The CMNI 46 is thought to measure how strongly participants who complete this scale, how strongly they conform to certain classic Western masculine norms, North American white masculine norms, such as emotional control, winning, playboy, etc. You can see example item wordings next to each of those. So these are some of the common norms that we think a lot of American men, especially from a white racial framework, these norms that we're expected to follow if we want to be quote-unquote real men, right? So supposedly the CMNI 46 has 9 subscales, each measured by a cluster of items. The CMNI 46 from a correlated factors model would look like this. We've got all those subdimensions modeled with those 9 factors there, and a cluster of item loads on each, and then all those get to correlate with each other. In contrast, a bifactor model builds on that, and it says, up top are those 9 subscale specific factors, and then we've got the big overall conformity to masculine norms construct, which when people use the CMNI 46, sometimes they calculate a total score that is thought to measure that overall general CMN construct down there. So we wanted to verify, what is the CMNI 46 really measuring? Is it really able to measure the general factor as well as the specific factors, or is it more complicated? So we recruited 2 samples, a bunch of male adults and a bunch of male college students, mostly white. We got them from researchmatch.org, which is a research registry of adults across the United States, as well as a SONA subject pool from Midwestern University. We use chi-square difference testing to see whether the bifactor model or the correlated factors model or the unidimensional model or the second order model, which of those fit best. And the data was mixed. It was caught between saying the bifactor was the best versus the correlated factors. So we had to go deeper, and we used what are called ancillary bifactor measures. We found that general factor, that guy at the bottom that all the items loaded onto, it explained only 18 to 27% of the item variance across those 46 items. About 90% of those 46 items measured their assigned specific factor better than they measured the general factor. So what does this mean? In plain English, it means we want to use the correlated factors model to understand the theoretical structure of the CMNI 46. We actually don't want to use the bifactor. And the reason is the bifactor is good when you both have specific dimensions and a general dimension that's strong enough. But that general dimension, as we saw from those weak percent accounted for results on the last slide, that general dimension is super weak and doesn't really seem to be it doesn't deserve to be modeled. It's not strong enough to guarantee its existence. So there's no evidence really of an overall conformity to masculine norms construct. But there was evidence of those 9 specific types of conformity to those 9 specific norms. What does this mean for using this instrument? People who are clinicians or researchers, how they calculate scores with the CMNI 46. These results suggest that we should stop using the CMNI 46 total score. We can't just average the scores across all 46 items and say that's measuring overall conformity to masculine norms. Our results suggest that doesn't really exist, or at least with this instrument we can't tap that reliably. Maybe that's a real thing that exists, but this instrument is not the thing to try and measure it. But the results do support that, hey, we're able to use those 9 subscale scores to measure conformity to those 9 specific norms. So that's good. So basically, this instrument helps us conceptualize specific aspects of conformity, but not overall conformity. And that's kind of a new finding. And bifactor analysis helped us get that. Okay, moving on. Let's find another wildly different outcome. So a while ago, we did a study on the internalized stigma of mental illness scale 29. And this instrument is thought to measure how much internalized stigma, how much internalized self-hate and shame somebody feels about themselves because they identify as having mental illness, whether that's depression or schizophrenia or whatever it is. And so people with mental illness can take this instrument. It's not really appropriate for people who don't self-identify as having a mental illness. And this instrument, in theory, has 5 subscales. The items cluster into 5 themes or 5 factors. you can see some examples here. So for example, the alienation factor, an example item would be, having a mental illness has spoiled my life. So people who strongly agree that mental illness has spoiled their life would have a high score on this alienation factor, so to speak. So the stigma resistance factor at the bottom is a little different because it's reverse coded. It's got a positive valence. It talks about, I can move past stigma. So we reverse code all those items so that a higher overall score on the ISMI-29 means more internalized stigma, more bad stuff. Okay, so for this we got 758 adults living in the United States who self-identify as having depression and self-identify as having a mental illness. They're mostly women, mostly white, so that's an important demographic caveat to keep in mind in terms of generalizability of these results. When we compared models and had to use AIC and BIC differences, we found that the Bifactor model fit better than the correlated factors model or anything else. And again, a quick caveat, as I said, I'm not going to be explaining a lot of the fancy stats and stuff because people tend to be less interested in that. So forgive me when you hear me mention a stats thing and you're like, what is that? And we have to move on. So what we found when we went to the ancillary bifactor measures was that 92% of the total score variance was captured by the general factor, whereas only 5% of that total score variance was due to the 5 specific factors. And importantly, the majority of each subscale's true score variance was accounted for not by that subfactor, not by that specific factor, but actually by the general factor, 70 to 94% of that. So that what does that mean? What it means in plain English is that we want to use the bifactor model with this ISMI-29 because the data suggests there's both a general factor and some specific factors, but they're pretty weak. The ISMI-29 measures one big thing, overall internalized stigma of mental illness. It doesn't measure those specific 5 factors very well. Those subscales do not reliably measure the specific factors that they were intended to measure, that we thought they were measuring. Instead, those subscale scores actually are mostly just re-measuring that overall internalized stigma of mental illness construct. We thought they were measuring the specific thing. They're actually just remeasuring the big thing that we already have a total score to measure. We don't, so we want to use the ISMI-29 total score, but we don't want to use the subscale scores because those subscale scores are not actually measuring those subdimensions reliably. And again, we had no idea this was happening. And again, if these results are replicated and continue to be they're generalizable across groups, because we don't know that yet. More research has to come out. But if this sort of data keeps coming out on this instrument, it would suggest that we've got to stop using the subscale scores because they're not measuring what we think they are. But we can use the overall ISMI-29 total score. Okay. So that's a little primer into some examples of how bifactor analysis can really open our eyes to how our scales are operating and what we can use them for and what we can't. But I want to go into some stuff that I think is really kind of cool and uses some bifactor stuff. So as of this talk, this paper was under review, and it's about the daily spiritual experiences scale. It's a 16-item measure, and it uses a 6-point Likert scale, meaning that people who rate higher on it, who indicate more frequent daily spiritual experiences, have a higher score. In fact, I will show an example of it. So here's what the here's what the scale looks like. You have a handout, so that's what it looks like. So you can see higher scores when they answer many times a day. Let's go back to the PowerPoint here. Gotta switch that. Okay. All right, so it's a 16-item self-report instrument designed to measure ordinary daily experiences in daily life. Ordinary spiritual experiences in daily life. The D-says has been used in hundreds of religion and spirituality studies to measure experiences of relationship with and awareness of the divine or transcendent. Whereas many spirituality instruments were designed to be used with one religious group, such as Christians, the D-Says was specifically developed to be suitable for cross-cultural research with people from a variety of worldviews. The 16 D-Says items measure a wide variety of experiences, as you saw from the handout, and some focused on theistic experiences of relationship with a higher power, while others focused on non-theistic experiences having nothing to do with God or a higher power. So experiences like feeling awe or gratitude or connection with others or nature. And by including instructions at the top of the instrument that tell participants they're welcome to substitute the word God with another term that better represents the divine for that participant, and also including additional items that don't invoke the term God, the scale developers sought to create a D-Says that could validly capture the experiences of even atheists, because in theory they could swap out the word God for something that's more culturally congruent. So, researchers such as Koenig and colleagues have used the D-Says to directly compare the frequency of experiences across those who are not religious nor spiritual, which we'll abbreviate the NRS, those who are spiritual but not religious, and those who are religious and spiritual. So we'll be using those acronyms throughout. However, before you use the D-Says or any instrument to compare scores across different groups, like those three, you first need to establish that the instrument has the same theoretical structure and meaning for each group being compared. This equivalence of meaning can be established by using measurement equivalence invariance testing. And if the D-Says fails to demonstrate invariance across the NRS, the SNR, and the RS, this means that the D-Says is measuring different things in the different groups. And thus comparing scores across these groups would be like comparing apples to oranges, something we need to avoid. Thus, our first study objective was to test the invariance of the D-Says across these three groups. Empirical results from published studies generally conclude that having more frequent experiences is associated with better mental and physical health, and that increasing experiences could prevent some negative psychological effects of trauma and chronic disease. However, there's some psychology of non-religion scholars who suggest that experiences of connection with the divine may not be culturally relevant or palliative for NRS people who, by definition, don't believe in the existence of the divine. Therefore, it's best to directly test the claim of a positive relationship between experiences and well-being among the NRS. So our sample consisted of 1,623 adults living in the United States who were mostly middle-aged, female, white, and well-educated. So again, keep in mind this sample when we think about generalizability. We asked everyone to rate themselves using the Fetzer Institute's overall self-ranking items, which ask participants how religious they are and how spiritual they consider themselves to be on that 1 to 4 point scale. We used those responses on that religion and spirituality item to place participants into three groups. The 422 participants who indicated that they were not religious at all and also not spiritual at all were placed in the not religious nor spiritual group, the NRS. The 467 who said they were spiritual, at least to some degree, but were not at all religious, were placed in the spiritual but not religious group. And finally, the 734 who said they were both spiritual and religious were placed in the religious and spiritual group, the RS. You'll notice that the denominational self-identity labels, such as atheist, agnostic, Roman Catholic, those labels used by people in these groups varies across group, and there's even some overlap. And this highlights the complex interplay of who we say we are in terms of our self-identity and what we say we believe in terms of identifying as religious or spiritual. And perhaps this is a potential study limitation that we can talk about more during the Q&A, and there's certainly room to critique this method of chunking people into groups, but every method has its own limitations, including by using self-identity labels. All right, so procedure. We use the researchmatch.org database once again, as well as some internet convenience sampling to get ourselves sufficient number of people in these three groups. We use an online Qualtrics.com survey so that people can complete the instrument online, making it accessible to more people in a wider area. In terms of our measures, we of course included the 16-item DSAs. We used the Meaning in Life questionnaire, which measures, we used specifically the presence subscale of the Meaning in Life questionnaire, not the search subscale. We used the 5-item satisfaction with life scale, and then we used the global mental health and the physical mental health subscales from the PROMIS, from the 10-item subset of global health. And a brief mention that all Cronbachs were above 0.73 with the exception of a 0.67 for the DSAs among the not religious nor spiritual, which we'll get to later. Study Objective 1. As you may recall, we want to test the invariance across the 3 groups. But before we can do that, we need to first establish the factor structure of the instrument for each group separately. So when we look at the literature, because there's been a bunch of studies that have tried to pin down what's the factor structure of the DSAs. We got a lot of studies saying it's unidimensional. We've got one study saying it's unidimensional with 7 correlated residuals, which means that there's pairs of items that are worded so similarly, or that people interpret so similarly that they're basically repetitive, maybe, in a way. And they form what are called testlets. They're super similar, and so people respond to them really similarly, and it kind of messes with your factor structure. But you can allow those items to kind of hang out together by specifying a correlated residual, and that's how we can account for some of that funkiness of those correlated residuals. The literature has also suggested that maybe the DSAs is composed of 2 correlated factors, so it's got a theistic factor and a non-theistic factor, which we talked about earlier, or 2 correlated factors where it's a big dominant factor that has most of the items and then a 2 or 3 item compassionate love factor. So there's a lot of different opinions and different data. So we tested them all, or most of them. We had to stop somewhere. So there were a total of 8 measurement models from the literature that we tried out, because we wanted to really dig deep. And we used all 8 measurement models, and we tried out all 8 for each of the 3 groups. So simple math, multiplication, that's 24 models we tested, right? So the unidimensional model with 7 correlated residuals was the only semi-adequately fitting one. So you can see some cutoffs. The TLI is below the 0.9 that's generally considered acceptable. And the rest of them are kind of in the typical adequate range. None of them are in the good range, at least if you consider Weston and Gore 2006 as cutoffs. The other 23 models, literally every other model, was a poor fit. And I should mention that unidimensional model with the correlated residuals was only adequate for the religious and spiritual folks, not for the other 2 groups. Okay, so far we're struggling to find good factor models, and that's why we returned to EFA. We said, okay, let's go back to the beginning. Let's try and figure out with this sample what would be an optimal factor structure. Give the instrument the best chance to find something suitable. So we started first with the NRS, the not religious and not spiritual folks, right? So we did a principal axis factor analysis with Promax rotation, which is an oblique rotation. Again, see that little star down there, skim alert. I can't go into much detail about this. Happy to say more at Q&A. Those are the eigenvalues. So you notice they decrease in the first 4 in particular are above chance per parallel analysis. So when you look at parallel analysis, the squeeze plot, and conceptual interpretability, they all seem to say we should retain 4 factors. Not 3, not 5, but 4. Unfortunately, only about 42% of the total variance in the items was accounted for by the 4 factors, so that's a limitation. You usually want at least 50%. So, how did these 16 items cluster together in groups? How did they want to hang out with each other? Because remember, the scale developer said that this is a unidimensional instrument. All items should want to hang out on just 1 factor together. What we saw from the EFA is it said, the EFA said, the best I can do is I think there's 4 factors here. So the factor 1, colored in green, is a testlet item. So we talked about testlets before. You notice the 2 items there, 4 and 5, are really similarly worded. They like to hang out together, and so they form a testlet. So it's not really, I'm not sure that that's a conceptual factor that stands on its own. I think it's more of an artifact. The second factor is the non-theistic factor. You notice all those items don't invoke any God language at all, right? They're non-theistic. So it makes sense that they all want to hang out together. And then, for some reason, factor 3 and factor 4, we have these 2 theistic factors that are both talk about God and divine related stuff. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out why they wanted to form two factors. I can't see a pattern of differences about why they want to separate. I tried a three-factor model, and just the factor 3 and factor 4 want to stay separate for whatever reason. So this is how it looks when you administer it to a group of non-religious and not spiritual people. It forms these 4 wonky factors, not a single factor. So that's important to know. And in terms of informing why the factors might have formed in that way, here are the descriptive statistics. First column is the mean, second column is the standard deviation, third column is the mode. And you'll notice when you look at the mode that the most common response for most of the items is 1, which is not at all. I never have this spiritual experience you asked me about. It's only the blue items, the non-theistic items, where we saw the NRS answering, yeah, I have these sometimes, right? So it's pretty stark. Very few atheists, or excuse me, very few not religious nor spiritual people, which include atheists and a bunch of other folks, very few of them endorsed God-related stuff, which maybe is overwhelmingly obvious to some of us. We followed up the EFA with a CFA because we said, okay, EFA suggests this is the best model we can find. We wanted to try and confirm through a CFA framework that, yeah, this is a decent model. Now, we use the same data, which generally you want to have a fresh batch of participants to confirm, because basically it increases artificially the chances that the CFA model is going to fit well. So we're stacking the deck in favor of good fit, and that's important to keep in mind as a limitation. The EFA suggested that 4 factors model. We tried that as well as a bunch of alternative models that tweak it slightly, included with some correlated residuals and stuff, and we were not able to find a CFA model of the DSAs that provided a suitable fit, that provided an adequate fit among the NRS. So it was basically like, the DSAs doesn't have a suitable factor structure with this population. So let's switch gears. We switched to the spiritual but not religious folks. Use the same sort of thing, but after the initial principal axis factoring, we saw that first eigenvalue was much, much bigger than the second eigenvalue, and Cho et al. 2015 gives us a rule of thumb. They say if the first eigen is 3 times the second eigenvalue, we want to use a bifactor exploratory factor analysis instead of a traditional one. So we did that. We used Bijum rotation and M+. Again, sorry for all the statistical gobbledygook. The eigenvalue, again, similar. And when you boil it all down, conceptual interpretability and simple structure argued for the retention of 3 factors. Here they are. Okay, so this is spiritual but not religious folks this time, right? So we see a big general factor, right, on which almost all of the items load quite strongly. Then you got that testlet factor again, those 2 items wanting to hang out. Okay, fine. Then you got a specific factor showing up once again. Right? So you see the items 2, 6, 11, 12, 13, 14 are splitting their variance between the general factor and the non-theistic factor. So those items want to contribute to the general as well as hang out on the side amongst themselves as a group of non-theistic factors. So there's some similarities and differences with what we saw with the atheists, right? Excuse me, with the not religious and not spiritual folks. And then when we look at the descriptive statistics, on the left you can still see the old data for the NRS, but then you can also compare it to the SNR. So what we start to see is everything's kind of gradually moving up. So the spiritual but not religious folks are starting to warm up to the possibility of some frequent things related to God items, and maybe they're swapping out the term God for something else. It just depends on where that spiritual but not religious person is, right? But we can see an interesting pattern there. Finally, we did a CFA to try and confirm that model with this group. And how we specified it is we said there's the general factor, then there's the specific non-theist factor, and then that testlet, we didn't want to model as a factor. It's going to cut it off at the knees. So instead, we allowed those 2 items' residuals to correlate, like we had talked about before. That was going to be our best bet, and indeed we found adequate fit for that. So that was okay. This sort of model is okay for this group. And so we know from this data that among the spiritual but not religious, the DSIS is characterized by a bifactor structure with one well-defined general DSC factor that has both theistic and non-theistic components. So items from both sides of the fence hang out together and form this general factor. And then simultaneously, there's also this adequately defined, it's a little weaker, it's adequately defined spiritual factor that is just the non-theistic item. So it has that specific non-theist flavor to it. So lastly, we worked with the religious and spiritual folks. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail. It played out very similarly as with the spiritual but not religious. So basically the same thing. You got the general in which everybody parties with, you got the specific factor with those items, and you got the test slit. So we're seeing basically the same thing. Again, descriptive statistics, we see a big bump across all the experiences. The people who are religious and spiritual are like, hell yeah, no problem. I've got all these experiences. So people tended to answer highly across all of this. It was all good. Where we didn't see that restriction on those God items like we did for the other two groups. Okay. And then we use CFA to confirm. Again, don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty, but we found the same thing. So for both the spiritual but not religious and the religious and spiritual, the D says has this bifactor structure with that big general and that specific non-theist factor. Okay. So what that means is we can now test formally for invariance. We used a sequential constraint imposition approach. Sounds real fancy, right? We used Chen's 2007 recommended cutoffs, so we didn't have to deal with just the limitations of a chi-square. Now, the NRS had that funky four-factor structure, totally different from the SNR and the RS, so right out of the gate we know it cannot demonstrate equivalence. We cannot be comparing the NRS scores with the other folks' scores. It's not happening. But because the SNR and the RS had the same exact bifactor structure, we could test for invariance. So we did that. Again, big wall of scary text. What you need to know, configural metric and scalar invariance did hold. In plain English, that means that the D says demonstrated strong invariance across the SNR and RS, and what that means is that it's measuring the same two factors in both groups. That's the take-home message. We're measuring the same two factors in basically the same way. So, what this means is that the D says did not demonstrate unity dimensionality in any group, which is surprising because that's what most people think the D says is like. And the D says may not be suitable for the NRS because we couldn't find a factor structure that would work for them, any factor structure. And we certainly cannot compare the NRS to the other two groups because that would be an apples to oranges comparison because they're not measuring the same things. And what this importantly is, we thought that maybe the instructions to substitute the word God for another term would make the scale okay for the NRS, but it didn't because we weren't able to find a suitable factor structure. It's just not working out. However, the good news is that we can make apples to apples comparisons between the SNR and the RS because the D says is measuring the same thing, the general and that specific non-theistic thing across those two groups. So that's cool. All right. Switching gears, the second objective was to directly test that claim of a positive relationship between daily spiritual experiences and well-being among the non-religious and not spiritual folks. So we tested one structural equation model per group to do this. Won't get into the weeds on the details of that, but here's what we found. So let's look at the non-theistic rows so far. So whenever you see a non-theistic mentioned in a row, let's check those out. You'll notice a bunch of green stuff. So you'll notice the positive correlations colored in green text. That's, if it's green, it's a positive correlation. If it's red, it's a negative correlation. If it's black, it means it was not significant. Okay? So those green correlations tell us that participants who had more frequent non-theistic experiences were more likely to report better well-being. And this was true for everybody, for people in all three groups, the NRS box at the top, the SNR box in the middle, and the RS box at the bottom. It's true for everybody. In contrast, the relationship between theistic experiences and well-being was dependent on group membership, meaning that theistic experiences and well-being were generally positively associated among the RS at the bottom there, but among the NRS and SNR, having more frequent theistic experiences was generally not associated with better well-being. In fact, these experiences were associated with poorer meaning and satisfaction with life among the NRS. So claims that theistic experiences are good for everyone, regardless of worldview, would be challenged by these findings, because that just wasn't the case with the NRS and the SNR. One more thing. Most researchers assume that the D says is unidimensional, and that therefore it's okay to average the scores of those 16 items to calculate a single mean score for the D says and treat that mean score as a valid measure of overall spiritual experiences. What would have happened if we skipped all that factor analysis stuff we just did and just started using a single mean score for the D says and just ignored that multidimensionality that we found? To find out, we did some post hoc analyses. We conducted multiple regression analyses using SPSS to examine how the D says mean score relates to the 4 well-being measures. For all 3 groups, the D says mean score was generally positively associated with well-being. Thus, when the theistic and non-theistic items are crammed together into a single D says mean score, it masks the differential relationships that the non-theistic and theistic items have with well-being. We would have looked at these correlation coefficients in those blue boxes and concluded that spiritual experiences, even the theistic ones, seem to be linked with better well-being for even the non-religious and not spiritual folks. We would have then used these findings to offer clinical implications regarding the potential promise of increasing daily spiritual experiences to enhance the lives of everyone. But we would have been wrong, right? So there's 2 final conclusions from this part. First, daily spiritual experiences have a complex relationship with well-being that depends on one's secular, spiritual, or religious worldview. It's not one size fits all. Second, using a single mean score for the D says can mask this reality. It can hide it. So people who use the D says should first please verify the dimensionality of the D says in your sample before deciding how to score it, because otherwise you may report results that mask the truth. Our final study, my favorite study, about measuring spiritual fitness in the U.S. Army. The Army's Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program draws upon the principles of positive psych to help soldiers and civilian personnel learn how to increase their resilience in 5 fitness domains, including the domain of spiritual fitness. This program uses a secular conceptualization of spiritual fitness that is designed to avoid invoking religious or theological concepts so that it can be usefully applied to all program participants, even atheists. They define spiritual fitness. Skip that. They define spiritual fitness as a sense of meaning and purpose in life. To measure the spiritual fitness of participants, a team of psychologists created the 5-item spiritual fitness scale. Participants filled out the self-report instrument online, and those who score low are told that they're probably having existential struggles and should complete remedial training to restore their spiritual fitness. Here are the 5 Likert-type scale items, and if you look at the handout I provided you, you can see the Army's 5 and then the revised 5. We'll talk about that in a minute. Despite its intended universality, my colleagues and I thought the scale's 5 items contained theological language, theistic language, right? That could result in less valid measurement of the spiritual fitness of non-religious participants. For example, atheists may think that item 1 is asking, to what extent do you have a personal relationship with God? Spiritually fit atheists may therefore answer, not like me at all, because they do not believe God exists, even if they're spiritually fit folks. Likewise, spiritually fit atheists who live life with a clear sense of purpose may still answer, not like me at all, for item 5, because they do not believe there is an externally determined or God-given purpose for their life. In summary, if atheists choose not like me at all for one or more of these spiritual fitness items, not because they're spiritually unfit, but merely because these items sound like they are asking about theological beliefs, these atheists will get spiritual fitness scores that do not accurately represent their true level of spiritual fitness. Why do we care? The spiritual fitness scale is designed to accurately measure the spiritual fitness and predict the current and future existential well-being of participants, including atheist soldiers. But if the presence of theological language in the scale's items leads the scale to be a less accurate measure of spiritual fitness for atheists, then this could lead to underestimation of their spiritual fitness and less accurate prediction of their existential well-being. This is a worrisome possibility because this underestimation could result in spiritually fit atheists being told they're spiritually unfit and need to see a therapist to get fixed. Such microaggressions could alienate atheist military personnel, which is not great for Army morale. Thus, the goal of this study was to determine whether or not, let's bring it on back, was to determine whether or not the theological phrasing in the Army's spiritual fitness scale leads to less accurate prediction of atheists' existential well-being and underestimates their true level of spiritual fitness. To accomplish this, we created a revised version of the Army's original spiritual fitness scale composed of items that do not use theological phrasing but still assess sense of meaning and purpose in life, which seems to be the core definition of spiritual fitness, right? We then had our participants complete both versions so that we could measure the impact of including versus replacing the theological phrasing. Our first hypothesis was that the Army version would demonstrate reduced concurrent and predictive evidence of validity for atheists. We were worried that replacing the theological language would reduce the cultural sensitivity of the instrument for Christian participants, however. Therefore, we put forth a second hypothesis that the revised version would demonstrate reduced concurrent evidence of validity for Christians. A third hypothesis was that the Army version would underestimate the spiritual fitness of atheists. So, we got a few samples. The first is 448 atheists who were associated with the military. Mostly male, mostly white, middle age. A third of them at current active duty in the military. Most of the rest were vets or inactive. In terms of branch, well, good representation across the groups, mostly the Army, which is fitting because it's an Army program. Sample 2 was a bunch of atheist civilians we recruited through convenience sampling, 789 of them, similar demographics. Sample 3 was a group of Christian civilians, and this was drawn from a student population via a SONA subject pool, mostly female, mostly white, mostly first or second year students. Internet convenience sampling, as I mentioned, for the first two samples, both of the atheist samples, we measured them at time 1, and then we also got in touch with them 6 months later to ask them about well-being criterion variables. That way we could get some predictive evidence of validity. Longitudinal stuff is good. So our measures were the Army version and the revised version. You can see each of them on your handout. And then the criterion variables, we had 14 different criterion variables, so we could get a robust view of things. So the revised scale creation, I believe there is a purpose for my life as an example item. Here's how we changed it. I live my life with a clear sense of purpose. So that's an example of how we tweaked it. For those of you watching this video, let me scroll down here. So you can pause the video at this point, and you can see the Army versions 1 through 5. Here's the revised version 1 through 5. So here's how we modified them from this to this. So if you want to check those out, pause the video. Returning now to the PowerPoint. I'm going to have to do that switcheroo again. Alrighty. Okay, so that's how we modified those items. And we had to establish that this revised version didn't start measuring something way different through these revisions. So when we looked at the two instruments, we found they're both one factor when we fit them with EFA. And they both accounted for a similar amount of total variance in the items, though of course we'd love that to be 50% or above. And the internal consistency, those Cronbach alphas, pretty similar, right? And when we correlate the scores between the Army version and the revised version, because again, everybody's taking both versions, as well as all those well-being criteria. So when we correlate their scores on the Army version and the revised version, that's a correlation of 0.91, which is super high, which most scholars would take to mean, yeah, you know, they're measuring the same thing. Despite those little tweaks you did, we're still measuring the same thing. Our criterion variables were a bunch. We got the life engagement test, which is the purpose of a pupil's purpose in life derived from engaging in meaningful activities, measure how much that is the case for folks. We got the sense of coherence measure, which is the tendency to see the world as manageable and meaningful. And we've got self-concept clarity, which is the extent to which an individual's self-beliefs are clearly defined and stable. And then we've got life satisfaction, measures of depression, anxiety, and stress, and then a measure of general health from the SF-36, which measures a bunch of dimensions of general health, which we'll see in a bit. So, first hypothesis. Theological language leads to weaker concurrent/predictive evidence of validity among atheists. In other words, the Army version demonstrates weaker correlations with those criterion variables compared to the revised version. So was this true? And indeed, half the time it was. We used dependent correlation comparison to see whether the difference in correlation was significant statistically. And so we found about half the time, yeah, when you use the Army version that had that theological language that we thought was problematic, it ended up reducing the validity of the Army version. Okay. For time 1 atheist civilians, similar deal. Again, we don't have a lot of time to dwell on each thing. Just look at the pattern. I colored it in red if it was reduced, black if it was no effect. When we looked at longitudinal data, so that their time 1 responses on the Army versus the revised version predict their future well-being, we didn't see any effect. So the predictability was pretty similar for the atheist military folks. But for the atheist civilians, that predictive validity was sometimes reduced, and sometimes it was no effect. All things considered, partial support, not full support for this hypothesis. It reduced the evidence of validity of the Army version sometimes, not always, but sometimes. But importantly, the theological language never ever increased validity. It never helped. It only hurt, if anything, right? Switching to Hypo 2, replacing theological phrasing we worried would lead to weakened concurrent evidence of validity for Christians, because the Christians might really like that theological language. It might be really culturally relevant for them, right? So in other words, the revised version we thought would demonstrate weaker correlations with criterion variables than that Army version that retained the theological language. So we were expecting something like this, some reductions. We found the exact opposite. For the majority of dependent variables, we saw that stripping out that theological language actually seemed to make for a better scale for these Christian respondents. Interesting, right? So, hypothesis 2 wasn't supported. Our fears were not supported. It actually improved evidence of validity among Christians. Hypothesis 3, theological phrasing will lead to underestimation of atheists' spiritual fitness. For this to be true, 2 conditions must be met. First, atheist scores must be lower on the Army version than the revised version. Second, Christian scores got to be the same on both versions. And we found exactly that. For the atheist military, let's look at the top. Army version, their score on how spiritually fit they are, it's much lower than on the revised version, right? So that theological language is really underestimating their true level of spiritual fitness. And the effect was pretty strong. So strong effect is 0.8. We were getting double that. Same thing with the atheist civilians. And when we look at the Christian civilians, look at that. Same mean. So regardless of whether Christians took the Army or the revised version, they were getting scored in the same way. So our 2 conditions were met. Hypothesis 3 was supported, meaning that we were seeing empirical evidence of underestimation of atheist spiritual fitness. So, to conclude, theological phrasing in that Army version only reduced validity for atheists and Christians. It never improved it. It sometimes reduced validity, sometimes had no effect. It did underestimate atheist spiritual fitness, and it seems like maybe replacing theological phrasing benefits everybody. I did share these findings with the U.S. Army. I'm not quite sure how far they took it, but I did my part and I did share what I found with them. The take-home point of this entire talk, which I hope you're kind of seeing the point through these examples. Good psychological measurement matters, right? When we don't measure things accurately, our findings may misrepresent reality. When our findings are off the mark, the conclusions and implications we offer may miss the mark, right? Good measurement, as we saw from some of these examples related to religion, helps us being culturally sensitive in our research and practice. If we use an instrument that's not well suited to non-religious people, for example, and we end up telling them they're spiritually unfit or other sorts of microaggressive messages, it's not great. right? So I think these are great examples of how when we measure things really carefully, it can just lead to better stuff for everybody. References, you can find references from this talk in these papers. You can click on any of those links or access those articles. There's PDFs of all of them on my website except the one under review, although if it's published by the time you're watching this, you'll be able to click on the PDF link for that and check out the references in there. And thank you so much. I hope this was intriguing to you, and welcome your feedback and comments, and hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit about some of what I do in my research in terms of the multicultural measurement evaluation portion of what the Hammer Lab does. And I also do a lot of work on what stops people from seeking help, which oftentimes involves a lot of this bifactor and measurement, especially cross-culturally. A lot of that stuff is a part of my research. So thanks for checking this out.